Imagine a paradise country with white sandy beaches and crystal clear waters. Now imagine the same place where, overnight, everything collapses. Desperate people in the streets fighting for food, fuel, and medicine. Luxury homes of politicians being set on fire by the hungry population. A president fleeing the country amid chaos. Welcome to Sri Lanka, the nation that in 2022 staged one of the most dramatic economic collapses in recent history. A country that saw its currency lose 80% of its value, inflation exceed 50%, and millions of people pushed into poverty in a matter of months. But what few know is that behind this crisis lies a web of corruption, disastrous decisions, and a family that ruled the country as their private kingdom. The Rajapaksas, a political clan that dominated Sri Lanka for years, implemented such irresponsible economic policies that they drove the entire country to the brink. And if you think this story begins and ends in 2022, prepare to be surprised. Sri Lanka carries much deeper scars. A brutal civil war that lasted 26 years, devastating terrorist attacks, and ethnic tensions that remain latent to this day. How did a tourist destination that enchanted travelers from around the world transform into a scene of political chaos and despair? And more importantly, what does this teach us about the fragile balance between prosperity and collapse? Sri Lanka is a relatively small island, with only 65,610 square kilometers. To give you an idea, it's a bit larger than the state of West Virginia. Located in the Indian Ocean, south of India, its geographical position has always been strategic, serving as an important commercial point between East and West. The country has a tropical climate, with temperatures rarely falling below 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The contrast between landscapes is impressive. Paradise beaches on the coast, verdant mountains in the center of the country, where the famous tea plantations are located, and arid plains in the north. This small island is home to about 22 million people, divided mainly between two ethnic groups. The Sinhalese, 75% of the population, and the Tamils, 15%. This ethnic division, which seems like just a geographical detail, was a spark for one of the bloodiest conflicts in the region. Being on a crucial maritime route, Sri Lanka has always attracted the interest of international powers. Today, China and India compete for economic and political influence over the country, using everything from billion-dollar loans to infrastructure projects to ensure their presence in the region. Sri Lanka's history is as rich as it is tragic. There are records of civilizations on the island dating back more than 3,000 years, with ancient kingdoms that built impressive cities and advanced irrigation systems. In the 16th century, Sri Lanka, then known as Ceylon, began to be colonized by Europeans. First came the Portuguese, attracted by the spices, then the Dutch, and finally the British, who took the island in 1796. The British colonial era radically transformed the country. They introduced large-scale tea cultivation and brought Tamils from India to work on plantations, altering the ethnic composition of the island and planting the seeds of conflict that would explode decades later. In 1948, Ceylon gained its independence, and in 1972 the country changed its name to Sri Lanka. But peace didn't last long. Tensions between Sinhalese and Tamils grew, especially when the government began implementing policies that favored the Sinhalese majority. In 1983, a bloody civil war erupted between the government and the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam LTT, a separatist group fighting for the creation of an independent state for Tamils. For 26 years, Sri Lanka experienced one of Asia's most brutal conflicts, with suicide bombings, civilian massacres, and children being recruited as soldiers. It's estimated that more than 100,000 people died during this period. The war ended only in 2009, when the government, led by then President Mahinda Rajapaksa, launched a devastating military offensive that annihilated the Tamil Tigers. But victory came with accusations of war crimes, with reports of summary executions and deliberate bombings of hospitals. It was in this context that the Rajapaksa family consolidated their power. At the height of the Rajapaksa government, Nearly 40 family members held important positions in government and state-owned companies. It was practically a dynasty controlling the country. Meanwhile, the country tried to recover not only from the war, but also from the devastating 2004 tsunami, which killed more than 30,000 people. And when everything finally seemed to be improving, with tourism booming and the economy growing, the COVID-19 pandemic arrived, and soon after, the economic collapse that shocked the world. Before the 2022 crisis, Sri Lanka was considered one of Asia's most promising tourist destinations. The island has attractions for all tastes, from paradise beaches like Mirissa and Unawatuna to historic cities like Gao, with 16th century Portuguese fortress. In the interior of the country, Kandy houses the Temple of the Sacred Tooth, which supposedly guards the tooth of Buddha and is one of Buddhism's most important religious sites. In Sigiriya, tourists can climb a 656-foot high rock to see the ruins of an ancient fortress at the top with ancient frescoes. The tea plantations in the central mountains offer breathtaking landscapes. The trains that travel through the region are considered one of the most beautiful railway journeys in the world, winding between green valleys and mountains covered with plantations. For wildlife lovers, Yala National Park has one of the highest concentrations of leopards in the world, plus elephants, buffaloes, and hundreds of bird species. The beaches of Trincomalee are known for diving opportunities and blue whale watching. Before the crisis, tourism accounted for about 12% of the country's GDP and employed more than 1 million people. In 2018, more than 2.3 million tourists visited the island. For those planning to visit Sri Lanka today, it's important to take some precautions. The political and economic situation is still unstable. Fuel and energy shortages may affect travel, and it's advisable to always have cash on hand, as ATMs frequently run out of notes. On the other hand, tourism is slowly recovering, and prices are lower than ever, an opportunity to visit the country spending less and with fewer tourists at the main attractions. Sri Lanka's economy is a case study of how disastrous decisions can lead an entire country to collapse. Before the crisis, the country had a per capita GDP of about $3,800 annually in 2019, placing it in the lower middle income country category. The average monthly income of a worker was approximately 40,000 Sri Lankan rupees, about $200 at the time. In Colombo, the capital, basic rent cost around 25,000 rupees, $125, for a simple apartment, while basic food for a family of four was around 30,000 rupees, $150 monthly. But all this changed dramatically with the 2022 crisis. Inflation soared over 50%, the value of the rupee plummeted, and prices of basic foods tripled. Suddenly, middle-class families found themselves unable to buy essential items. How did this happen? First, the Rajapaksa government implemented massive tax cuts in 2019, drastically reducing state revenue. Then, in 2021, they banned the import of chemical fertilizers overnight, trying to make agriculture completely organic. The result was disastrous. Agricultural production plummeted. Sri Lanka had to import basic foods, and tea exports took a severe hit. Added to this, the pandemic eliminated tourism, a crucial source of foreign income. With fewer dollars entering the country and huge debts to pay, Sri Lanka simply ran out of international reserves. In April 2022, the country defaulted on its $51 billion external debt. To make matters worse, many of the infrastructure projects financed by China, such as the Hambantota port, became white elephants. Underutilized mega projects that generated little economic return but created enormous debts. The port had to be leased to China for 99 years when Sri Lanka couldn't repay the loans. Today, the country is trying to rebuild with the help of the IMF, which approved a $3 billion rescue package in 2023. But recovery is slow and painful, with austerity programs that include tax increases and subsidy cuts. Behind Sri Lanka's economic collapse is a culture of endemic corruption that gained strength during the reign of the Rajapaksa family. It's estimated that the Rajapaksas diverted billions of dollars during their years in power, with secret accounts in tax havens and luxury properties around the world. The most emblematic scandal was that of Hambantota port, built in the Rajapaksa's hometown. The project cost more than $1.5 billion, financed by Chinese loans, but never attracted the expected volume of ships. Investigations revealed massive overpricing and million-dollar commissions paid to politicians. Another notorious case was a bond scam in 2015, when the central bank president was accused of manipulating public bond auctions to benefit a company linked to his son-in-law, causing millions of dollars in losses. Corruption in Sri Lanka permeates all levels of society, from police officers demanding bribes to public officials charging extra fees to process documents. This system especially harms the poorest, who lack connections or money to bribe authorities. But the darkest side of recent history goes beyond corruption. During the Civil War, both sides committed atrocities. The government was accused of deliberately bombing hospitals and areas where Tamil civilians were sheltering, while the Tamil Tigers pioneered the use of suicide attacks and recruitment of child soldiers. According to UN reports, between 40,000 and 70,000 civilians may have died in the last months of the conflict. Journalists and activists who tried to denounce these abuses were silenced. Some murdered, others forced into exile. In 2019, coordinated terrorist attacks hit churches and luxury hotels on Easter Sunday, killing more than 269 people. The attacks, claimed by local Islamic extremists, exposed serious security flaws. Intelligence reports warning about the plans were ignored due to political disputes. Discrimination against minorities also remains a problem. After the 2019 attacks, Muslims were targets of collective violence. The Tamil community, although the war has officially ended, still faces systematic discrimination, with territories in the north and east under heavy military presence. Amid all this, the 2022 crisis brought out the best and worst of Sri Lanka. On one hand, a civil society that finally said enough and demanded changes through massive peaceful protests known as Aragalaya struggle. On the other hand, it exposed the brutality of the regime, with security forces attacking protesters and the government declaring a state of emergency. Despite all the darkness that has enveloped Sri Lanka in recent years, rays of hope are beginning to emerge. The economic crisis, as devastating as it has been, sparked an awakening in the population. For the first time in decades, people united, regardless of ethnicity or religion, to demand change. The 2022 protests weren't just about gasoline or food. They were about the country's future. The fall of the Rajapaksa dynasty, with President Gotabaya fleeing the country and resigning via email, marked a historic moment. It was an unlikely victory of the people against a regime that seemed untouchable. And although the road to recovery is long, Sri Lanka already shows impressive resilience. The economy shows modest signs of stabilization. Inflation, which exceeded 70% in 2022, fell to about 20% in early 2024. Tourism is beginning to recover, with travelers taking advantage of more affordable prices. Tea and textile exports are slowly returning to pre-crisis levels. More importantly, there's a renewed sense of civic participation. Young people who previously felt alienated from politics are now actively involved in discussions about the country's future. New voices emerge, promising transparency and accountability, values long absent from Sri Lankan politics. The country is also re-examining its relationship with international creditors, seeking a healthier balance between China, India, and Western powers, rather than playing one against the other for short-term loans. Certainly, the challenges remain enormous. Ethnic reconciliation, economic reconstruction, and fighting corruption will require years of hard work. But Sri Lanka has already shown its ability to survive wars, tsunamis, and economic crises. This small island, once called the Tear of India for its shape and location, has shed too many tears throughout its history. Now, perhaps the time is coming to heal old wounds and build a brighter future for all its citizens. As an old Sinhalese proverb says, even the darkest night ends with the rising of the sun. And the sun always rises splendidly over the beaches of Sri Lanka, a daily reminder that there is always the promise of a new beginning.